On April 14, 2010, the European Organization for the Safety of Air Navigation issued an unprecedented order that would bring the continent to a standstill. Airspace across northern Europe was closed indefinitely due to volcanic ash drifting at cruising altitude. Over 100,000 flights were canceled in the span of just 6 days. 10 million passengers were stranded across the globe. Airlines lost an estimated $107 billion. And the cause? A volcano in Iceland that most people had never heard of and couldn't even pronounce. Eyjafjallajökull. But how exactly did a remote, ice-covered volcano that hadn't erupted in nearly 200 years manage to paralyze an entire continent? Why did scientists fail to predict the scale of what was coming? And how did a single eruption expose catastrophic weaknesses in modern aviation infrastructure that nobody knew existed? Watch closely, because what happened in Iceland in 2010 wasn't just unexpected. It was a wake-up call that changed how the world prepares for volcanic threats forever. March 2010. Deep beneath southern Iceland, something was stirring. For weeks, seismometers scattered across the region had been picking up unusual tremors. Small earthquakes, barely noticeable to anyone living nearby, were clustering beneath Eyjafjallajökull, a stratovolcano buried under a massive ice cap. The volcano had been quiet since 1823, nearly 2 centuries of silence. But now, magma was rising. The Icelandic Meteorological Office, which monitors the country's active volcanoes, noted the seismic activity but wasn't overly concerned. Iceland is one of the most volcanically active places on Earth, sitting directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates pull apart. Small earthquake swarms are common. They don't always lead to eruptions. In fact, most of the time they don't. The magma often cools and solidifies before reaching the surface. So when the tremors began in early March, scientists watched, measured, and waited. But on March 20th, 2010, at around 11:30 p.m. local time, the waiting ended. Eyjafjallajökull erupted. However, this wasn't the eruption that would shut down Europe. This was something else entirely. A fissure opened up on the volcano's eastern flank, away from the ice cap, in an area called Fimmvörðuháls. Lava began fountaining into the night sky, creating a spectacular display of molten rock and fire. Tourists and volcanologists rushed to the site. It was a relatively small, effusive eruption, the kind where lava flows steadily rather than exploding violently into the air. For nearly 3 weeks, the Fimmvörðuháls eruption continued. It became a tourist attraction. People hiked to the site to watch the lava fountains up close. Scientists monitored the activity, but there was no immediate danger. The lava wasn't threatening any towns. The ash plume was minimal. Everything seemed manageable. Some experts even believed this eruption might relieve the pressure, building beneath the volcano, preventing a larger, more dangerous event. They were wrong. On April 13, 2010, seismic activity beneath Eyjafjallajökull suddenly intensified. The character of the earthquakes changed. They became more frequent, more violent, and they were now concentrated directly beneath the summit, right under the ice cap. Then, just after midnight, on April 14th, the volcano exploded. This time, the eruption wasn't a gentle lava flow on the flank. It was a violent, explosive eruption directly through the summit ice cap. Meltwater from the ice mixed with the rising magma, creating a phenomenon known as a phreatomagmatic eruption. When water and molten rock meet, the water flashes to steam almost instantaneously, fragmenting the magma into billions of tiny glass shards. This is how volcanic ash is formed, and Eyjafjallajökull was now producing it in unimaginable quantities. Within hours, a towering ash plume rose more than 30,000 feet into the atmosphere. The eruption was so powerful that it punched through hundreds of feet of glacial ice, sending floods of meltwater racing down the volcano's flanks. Emergency services evacuated over 800 people from nearby farms and villages. But the real danger wasn't on the ground, it was in the sky. April 14th, 2010, early morning. As Eyjafjallajökull's ash plume climbed into the Icelandic sky, meteorologists monitoring the eruption noticed something alarming. The wind patterns were about to shift. A strong southeasterly wind was developing, and it was going to carry the ash cloud directly toward mainland Europe. Under normal circumstances, volcanic ash from Iceland would blow out over the Atlantic Ocean, away from populated areas, but these weren't normal circumstances. The jet stream, a fast-moving river of air high in the atmosphere, was positioned perfectly to funnel the ash plume straight across the North Atlantic and into European airspace. And because the eruption was so explosive, the ash wasn't just drifting at low altitudes. It was being injected directly into cruising altitude, the exact layer of the atmosphere where commercial aircraft fly, typically between 30,000 and 40,000 feet. Volcanic ash is not like the ash from a campfire. It's composed of tiny fragments of rock, minerals, and volcanic glass, each particle sharp and abrasive. When jet engines ingest volcanic ash, the particles melt in the extreme heat of the combustion chamber, then solidify again as they pass through cooler sections of the engine, coating turbine blades and clogging fuel nozzles. In severe cases, engines can flame out entirely, leaving an aircraft powerless at cruising altitude. This isn't a theoretical risk. In 1982, a British Airways Boeing 747 flew into an ash cloud from Mount Galunggung in Indonesia. All 4 engines failed. The plane descended from 37,000 feet to 12,000 feet before the crew managed to restart the engines and make an emergency landing. In 1989, a KLM Boeing 747 encountered ash from Mount Redoubt in Alaska. All 4 engines failed. The aircraft dropped thousands of feet before the engines could be restarted. These incidents proved that volcanic ash and commercial aviation do not mix. So when satellite imagery confirmed that Eyjafjallajökull's ash cloud was spreading rapidly toward Europe, aviation authorities faced an impossible decision: allow flights to continue and risk catastrophic engine failures, or ground aircraft across the continent based on models and predictions that had never been tested on this scale? At 12:00 p.m. GMT on April 15, 2010, Eurocontrol, the organization responsible for coordinating European air traffic, made the call. Airspace over the United Kingdom, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and parts of Denmark was closed. No commercial flights in or out, no overflights. By the following day, the closures expanded to include Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Switzerland, and northern Italy. It was the largest airspace closure in Europe since World War II. Airports became ghost towns. At London Heathrow, one of the busiest airports in the world, the normally packed terminals fell silent. No departures, no arrivals, just thousands of stranded passengers sleeping on floors, waiting for updates that never came. Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Paris, Charles de Gaulle, all closed. The ripple effects spread globally. Flights from North America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East bound for Europe were canceled or diverted. Passengers were stranded in cities they never intended to visit, unable to get home. The chaos wasn't limited to tourists. Business executives missed critical meetings. Medical patients couldn't reach hospitals for scheduled surgeries. Fresh food shipments rotted in warehouses. Auto manufacturing plants in Germany and France began shutting down production lines because just-in-time delivery systems, which relied on air cargo, collapsed. Kenyan flower farmers who exported roses to Europe by air watched millions of dollars worth of crops wither. The global economy, which had become so interconnected and dependent on air travel, was suddenly grinding to a halt. And back in Iceland, Eyjafjallajökull was still erupting. The ash plume continued to billow into the atmosphere, feeding the cloud that was now drifting across the continent. Scientists monitoring the eruption had no clear answer for when it would stop. Days? Weeks? Months? Nobody knew. So why was this eruption so unexpected? Why did scientists struggle to forecast its scale? To understand that, you need to understand Eyjafjallajökull itself. Eyjafjallajökull is a stratovolcano, meaning it's built up over thousands of years from alternating layers of lava flows, ash, and volcanic debris. It sits beneath a glacier of the same name, Eyjafjallajökull, which translates to Island Mountain Glacier. The ice cap covering the volcano is over 680 feet thick in some places, and it plays a critical role in how the volcano erupts. When magma rises beneath a glacier, the interaction between molten rock and ice creates explosive conditions. The heat from the magma melts the ice, producing massive amounts of water. When that water comes into contact with the magma, it flashes to steam almost instantly, increasing pressure inside the volcanic system. This pressure needs to be released, and when it is, the eruption becomes far more violent than it would be without the ice. This is exactly what happened on April 14th. The magma punched through the summit ice cap, triggering a phreatomagmatic eruption. The meltwater didn't just create explosive conditions, it also fragmented the magma into incredibly fine ash particles, much smaller than what would be produced in a dry eruption. These fine particles are particularly dangerous for aviation because they remain suspended in the atmosphere for much longer and can travel thousands of miles. But here's the problem: Eyjafjallajökull hadn't erupted in 187 years. The last eruption, which occurred between 1821 and 1823, was before modern seismology, before satellite monitoring, before volcanic ash dispersal models. Scientists had historical records, but those records were incomplete. They knew the volcano could erupt explosively, but they didn't have enough data to predict when or how it would behave. In the weeks leading up to the April 14th eruption, seismic activity did increase. GPS stations around the volcano detected ground deformation, indicating that magma was rising. But these signs alone weren't enough to predict the scale of what was coming. The March 20th flank eruption seemed to suggest that the volcano was releasing pressure gradually, not building up to a catastrophic explosive event. Dr. Magnus Tumi Gudmundsson, a geophysicist at the University of Iceland, was one of the scientists monitoring Eyjafjallajökull in real time. In interviews after the eruption, he explained that the transition from the effusive flank eruption to the explosive summit eruption caught many by surprise. The magma composition changed, the eruption style changed, and once the summit eruption began, the ash production was far greater than models had predicted. Another complication was the lack of real-time data on ash concentration at cruising altitude. When the eruption began, Europe didn't have a comprehensive network of ash detection instruments. Aviation authorities relied heavily on computer models that simulated ash dispersal based on wind patterns and eruption intensity. But these models had never been validated against an event of this scale. Were the ash concentrations really dangerous, or were authorities being overly cautious? Pilots flying near the edges of the closed airspace reported conflicting observations. Some saw thick gray clouds, others flew through areas where the ash was invisible but still present. Some airlines, frustrated by the prolonged closures and mounting financial losses, began conducting their own test flights. On April 19th, British Airways, KLM, and Lufthansa sent aircraft through areas that were supposed to be contaminated with ash. The planes returned safely with no engine damage. This created a new problem. If test flights were successful, why was airspace still closed? Airlines began publicly questioning whether the closures were necessary. Some accused regulators of overreacting. The pressure mounted, and on April 20th, European aviation authorities began reopening airspace in stages, allowing airlines to resume limited operations. But the science was clear. Volcanic ash is dangerous. The test flights were lucky. They flew through areas where ash concentrations happened to be low at that specific moment. But ash clouds are not uniform. They have pockets of high concentration surrounded by areas of lower concentration. A plane could fly through a safe zone 1 minute and encounter a lethal zone the next. What Eyjafjallajökull exposed was a fundamental gap in aviation safety protocols. The world had no standardized way to measure ash concentration in real time. No agreed-upon threshold for what was safe and what wasn't. No coordinated system for communicating volcanic threats to pilots and air traffic controllers. The eruption forced the global aviation industry to confront a threat it had largely ignored. While scientists and aviation officials debated ash concentrations and safety thresholds, millions of ordinary people were caught in the chaos. April 2010 became a global travel nightmare. At London Heathrow, passenger terminals were overflowing. People slept on benches, on floors, anywhere they could find space. Airlines handed out blankets and bottles of water, but there was no food. The airport's restaurants and cafes ran out of supplies. Tempers flared. Families with young children struggled to keep everyone calm. Elderly passengers, some with medical conditions, had no idea when they'd be able to get home. John, this is unlike anything we've ever seen. We're hearing that some passengers have been stranded here for over 3 days now. Behind me, you can see the sheer scale of the disruption. Thousands of people with nowhere to go, no flights available, and no clear answers about when this will end. The situation was even worse for passengers stranded in distant locations. A group of over 150 British tourists stuck in Nairobi, Kenya, were told by their airline that no flights would be available for at least a week. They pooled their money and chartered a bus. Their plan? Drive from Kenya to Egypt, then take a ferry across the Mediterranean to Europe. The journey would take days, crossing multiple countries and thousands of miles. But they had no other option. In New York, passengers bound for Europe were rebooked on flights to other continents, then rerouted through alternate hubs, turning what should have been an 8-hour flight into a multi-day odyssey. Some chose to give up entirely and return home, forfeiting their travel plans. Others refused to leave the airport, convinced that flights would resume at any moment. The economic damage extended far beyond airlines. Hotels near major European airports were fully booked as stranded passengers desperately searched for rooms. Rental car companies ran out of vehicles as people tried to drive across borders to reach their destinations. Train services across Europe were overwhelmed. The Eurostar, which connects the UK to mainland Europe via the Channel Tunnel, became one of the few viable options, but tickets sold out within hours. In Iceland itself, residents near Eyjafjallajökull faced their own crisis. The volcanic ash falling from the sky blanketed farms in thick gray powder. Livestock had to be kept indoors. Water supplies were contaminated. Farmers wore masks to avoid inhaling the fine particles. Some worried that the eruption would destroy their livelihoods. Tourism, one of Iceland's primary industries, came to a halt. Not because tourists didn't want to come, but because they couldn't get there. And then there were the casualties that went unreported in the headlines. A woman in the UK died after missing a critical heart surgery because her surgeon, stranded in another country, couldn't return in time. Business deals worth millions collapsed because executives couldn't attend. Meetings, academic conferences were canceled. Families missed weddings and funerals. The human cost of the eruption extended far beyond canceled flights. By April 20th, 6 days after the eruption began, the airspace closures started to ease. Winds shifted, carrying the ash plume farther north and out over the Atlantic. Eyjafjallajökull's explosive phase began to weaken. Ash production decreased. Airlines resumed limited operations, prioritizing long-haul international flights first. But the backlog was enormous. It took weeks for airlines to clear the passenger backlog. Some travelers didn't get home until early May, and even as flights resumed, the question lingered. What if this happened again? Eyjafjallajökull finally stopped erupting in October 2010, 6 months after it began. The eruption didn't produce massive lava flows. It didn't cause thousands of deaths. In fact, the direct casualties from the eruption itself were minimal. But the global disruption it caused was unprecedented, and it forced governments, scientists, and aviation authorities to rethink how the world prepares for volcanic threats. Before 2010, volcanic ash was treated as a regional problem. If a volcano erupted in Indonesia, airlines in Southeast Asia would take precautions. If a volcano erupted in Alaska, North American carriers would adjust their routes. But the idea that a volcano in Iceland could shut down an entire continent? That wasn't on anyone's radar. The eruption exposed critical weaknesses. First, there was no standardized system for measuring ash concentration in the atmosphere. Aviation authorities relied on computer models, but those models were crude. They could predict where ash might be, but not how much ash was present. After Eyjafjallajökull, this changed. European countries invested in new monitoring technologies, including LiDAR systems, which use laser pulses to detect ash particles in real time. Second, there was no agreed-upon safe threshold for ash exposure. Aviation regulators had operated under a zero-tolerance policy. Any detectable ash meant airspace closure. But airlines argued this was too extreme. After 2010, new guidelines were developed that classified ash concentrations into zones: no-fly zones for high concentrations, enhanced procedures zones for moderate concentrations, and normal operation zones for low concentrations. Third, communication between scientists, government agencies, and airlines was chaotic. During the crisis, conflicting information spread rapidly. Some authorities said it was safe to fly. Others said it wasn't. After the eruption, international protocols were established to ensure that volcanic threat information was shared quickly and accurately, but perhaps the most important lesson from Eyjafjallajökull was this. The world is more interconnected than ever before. Modern economies, transportation systems, and supply chains are built on the assumption that air travel will always be available. When that assumption is shattered, even for just a few days, the consequences ripple across the globe. And Iceland has more volcanoes. Lots of them. Katla, a volcano located right next to Eyjafjallajökull, is significantly larger and far more dangerous. Historically, Katla has erupted shortly after Eyjafjallajökull. The last time Eyjafjallajökull erupted, in 1821, Katla followed with a massive eruption in 1823. Scientists have been monitoring Katla closely ever since 2010, watching for signs that history might repeat itself. Eyjafjallajökull wasn't the deadliest eruption in modern history. It wasn't the largest, but it was, without question, the most unexpected. A quiet volcano that nobody was paying attention to managed to bring the modern world to its knees. It proved that volcanic eruptions aren't just a threat to people living near volcanoes. They're a threat to everyone.